Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our third webinar in this series of four. Today, we're going to be talking about a little bit about ransomware attacks, how to get your data back, what they're like, what you can do about them, all sorts of stuff. And for that conversation, I'm joined by Magda Shelley, who's head of cyber risk consulting at Marsh Asia. Magda, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Hank. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So for everyone listening, my name is Hank Schless. I'm a senior manager of security solutions here at Lookout. To give you a little bit of background on Magda here, she is a former CISO and has a PhD in telecommunications engineering, and as if it weren't impressive enough, is a certified information system security professional, or CISSP as we all know it. She's both an offensive and defensive security professional, which I think is pretty cool, and spends her free time hacking and researching cyber topics to help keep us all safe. Following 6 different countries and her own entrepreneurial journey, which I admire, she is currently leading the cyber advisory practice for Marsh Asia, based out of Singapore. So we're very happy to have her here this evening, as she's been supporting companies across the world as a CISO during her career, building a cybersecurity strategy for many, and technical roadmaps as this continuously changing technological landscape evolves. She's a keynote speaker for international conferences and is also recognized as a global international influencer. So Magda, again, thank you for joining us. That's quite an intro. Really excited to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you, Hank. I mean, the introduction was fantastic, and I am very excited to have the audience today and to share my insights about what is a very, very popular topic nowadays, ransomware. But I'm not going to start ahead of time.
Yeah, no, we can't get too ahead of ourselves. As excited we are to talk about this. But I do want to kind of jump right into the thick of it, right? I think that's the exciting part. Let's get into it. So, like you mentioned, ransomware is a very relevant topic right now. It's been in the news so much lately. And so I guess to start off, why do you think that the volume of attacks has increased so much?
Well, let's start from, the general concept and the general landscape that we're having, especially following the pandemic. We have definitely seen an increase of adoption of technology, digitalization. Companies went into the journey that was supposed to stay for 5, 10 years sometimes, especially in Asia. And now they face themselves and they are working remotely with all this technology embedded in their daily activities and operations. So this is definitely the first extremely important factor that affected the general risk profile of the companies and increased in general cyber attacks. However, what I really like to mention next as a second factor, and I think in my view, a great analogy to remember. If we, as employees of companies, business owners, CISOs, IT professionals, are in lockdowns because of a pandemic, well, what happens with the criminals? They need to continue their business as well, right? So they are continuing their business with remote, basically cyber attacks, or they're trying to use technology to attack companies and generate revenue. At the end, for them, it's almost like a business, but it's based on criminal and, of course, non-allowed activities. Now, this is from a perspective of just an introduction about the topic. What we have seen as well, which I believe is really interesting, is that aside from the fact that cyber attacks increased in general and criminals use technology to perform those attacks, we have seen as well, I would say, an increase in cyber attacks to industry or towards companies in industries that are perhaps not as used as others to be or to basically become attacked by cyber criminals. I'm gonna discuss this a little bit further because I have some, I think, amazing, feedback about how that works and why those companies have changed dramatically in terms of risk profile, not only for the reasons of the pandemic. But now, what else changed, which again, it's really interesting, is that I think criminals, which again, I'm using the word criminals on purpose, those are not just hackers. Hackers can be good and bad. like, in my intro, you mentioned I'm a defensive security, offensive security professional. So it is the decision of the individual. And therefore, those criminals who take the path and decide to attack companies, they found out that it's very lucrative. If we look at the latest news, we're not talking about any more, $300 of ransom request. We are talking about 40 millions, 50 millions. And now the question, or basically the statistic that is as well extremely interesting for our audience, is that 50% of companies who have been or which have been victims of ransomware attack ended up paying the ransom to recover operations. So there is a lot of aspects that actually made ransomware attacks more popular. First of all, again, the two factors that I mentioned at the beginning. And the third, as closing point of this question, is how lucrative those attacks became. And cyber criminals will not give up. They will continue to chase those, of course, financial gains.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of really good points in there, and actually one of my favorites too, which is distinguishing between the word hacker and the word cyber criminal or threat actor or whatever it may be, because I do agree with you that a lot of times, people choose to go one way or another with it, and there is ethical hacking, there's white hat, hacking, there's all of this that, our audience understands that, but I hope that the broader, tech community can kind of start to use those terms the right way. And the other interesting thing is that you mentioned about how these cyber criminals are operating more like a business. I mean, it's true. They're starting to kind of run that cycle of, figuring out the most effective way to carry out their business that increases profits and revenues that allows them to reinvest in more advanced tools. And it's just, it's funny because it's not only is the the ransoms increasing, but they're increasing because honestly, the criminals are becoming better at it, and they're able to kind of allocate those resources. So it's an interesting kind of alignment with how we all run, we all run a small business or whatever it may be. They're not doing it so differently. And okay, cool. So that's good. Obviously, the point of the pandemic, it's driven everyone remote, and to your point, the attackers almost need to kind of keep food on the table. So despite how they may get those funds. So let's dive into the anatomy of things a little bit. So can you explain to the audience a bit about how attackers get access in the first place? And usually, if there's kind of, in your experience and what you've seen, a part of the infrastructure or the organization overall that they tend to exploit in order to get that initial access?
I think, Hank, one point before going into the details of how the attacks happen is to very much clarify the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are around what is a ransomware. Reason being because we have been talking about it so much, and it is across all medias. We see it almost every day, unfortunately, online for new attacks and news around companies that we know very well and brands that we used to use. However, if we go into our environment or discuss the ransomware topic with the employees of a company, we realize, or at least from my experience, I realize that there is a lack of understanding what it really is. So let's start with ransomware. It comes from ransom and malware. So it's a combination of two words. Ransom, everyone knows it. We're talking about ransom. Malware, malicious software. So what does a ransomware do is a malicious software that will prevent access to data or systems asking for a ransom. Now, often there is a misconception, or basically is a misunderstanding of the access that is limited by the ransomware. Sometimes, again, employees might think that there is data that has been stolen by the ransomware attack. I will come back to that because it does happen. But again, the ransomware and how the whole principle works, and I'm sure today in the audience we have a lot of security professionals, IT professionals that know very well what does it mean. So my point is, take this definition to the people and your colleagues in order for you to raise the awareness about this new threat that is emerging so increasingly, across the world. So again, the ransomware itself doesn't steal the data. And what we have seen, obviously, is again coming back to the cyber criminals. They're trying to attack the companies by encrypting the data and asking for the ransom. Now, when they realized that certain companies were able to retrieve and continue their operations because they have very strong backups, they have very strong disaster recovery plans and processes, and they're able to do that and refuse to pay the ransom, the cyber criminals decided to find a different way, to leverage a different way in order for them to gain again more money. So what they have done, they evolved and they at the same time try to steal information that is valuable to the company. It might be personal data, it might be intellectual property, and then just leverage that and ask the company that if they don't pay the ransom, they will disclose that data to the dark web or wherever they want to. And now I think this is as well a very important point as we evolve in this discussion about ransomware, because ransomware has been there since years 2000, but it has dramatically changed from those years. And those change are actually adopting or adapting to the new environment, and those companies that either are fine to address it and they're really resilient, they can continue the operation, or the companies that actually are just not eager to pay at all and they're fine, to just erase everything and continue no matter what, even if they cannot recover from the backup, which obviously depends on the size, on the business operations, etc. So when we look at this evolution, the ways on how the cyber criminals are attacking the companies change as well. So we have the very traditional way of how cyber attacks happen and are successful, which is the human factor. Obviously, you send an email with an attachment that contains a malware. Someone will open that attachment and will see what's in the email. There's absolutely no doubt. I have never seen a phishing simulation with 0% of opened emails and opened attachment or clicked links. So let's first understand that reality. Now, when that happened and was very successful across the years, obviously we had solutions that allowed to eventually mitigate a little bit the threats. I want to as well point out here that no matter what kind of tools the companies will have in place nowadays to mitigate the phishing attempts or the malwares over email, we still do need to understand that not all security tools will be able to detect every single malware. And here, again, I'm trying to evolve from the traditional way of attacking companies to actually getting a little bit more sophistication and targeting still the human factor, but rather than assuming that I will send just the malware directly over email, knowing that that will be detected, I will actually prepare my attack by eventually obfuscating the malware, using techniques like mutation, or as simple as using files with what we call loaders. So we don't have directly the malwares embedded into the file, but we actually have commands line later that will be activated. So those are some of the techniques that cyber criminals have been using. And I want to come back in a bit on the loader, because that has been fascinating even for me to analyze of how that attack happens. On the other side, of course, we have other vulnerabilities that have been exploited by cyber criminals to perform those attacks. And one of the most popular is just having a remote desktop protocol accessible from outside. And as much as it might seem for our audience, oh no, it's not going to happen, as much, and I'm going to say that you can never be 100% sure that it will not happen for you as a company. Why? It's all about configuration at the end. It's all about making sure that your team will do the right things in order to ensure that there is no human error. And that is something that is not easy to achieve. So unless you have the assurance of controls, you as well might assume that there will be a failure of security control, and therefore eventually you might have a port somewhere open and allowing some kind of vulnerabilities. This is one other point of entry. And I talked to the first one is about the phishing, the second one about open services that might lead to exploitation. But the third one, which as well is, I would say, depending on the region, a little bit more common and less common, when you have literally common vulnerabilities across the environment, including non-traditional IT systems. And then obviously, if you are operating as a company in a complex environment with various assets, you need to ensure a certain level of patch management. Where I like to use the security updates, for general public. Now, if you use that, there is one, a timeline that will affect of how often you are able to address those updates that require you or require your team to update the assets. But on the other side, of course, aside from the timeline, is another topic that I believe we don't talk about. If you have automated patch management, well, sometimes it fails. It just doesn't work. Like you want to update your iPhone, for example, and then you need to restart, and it doesn't work. So the same happens, and the more complex the attack surface, the more assets you have, the more complex that challenge is. So again, when we look at those three entry points, I think cyber criminals have just the choice. And they are targeting nowadays companies with, I would say, a little bit of lower cyber maturity, so they can get in a little bit easier. However, what is very interesting is that they are targeting companies where the disruption of operations or business interruption is extremely expensive. So what do I mean by that, Hank? Again, very interesting, and I think really smart, honestly. Instead of attacking a company with an e-commerce website that is generating, let's say, 10 million, why don't they attack a company that has a manufacturing site where the production line interruption per hour leads to, for example, hundred thousands of millions losses? And this is again the differences. So the change in the targets, the change in the way of how cyber criminals are addressing not only the entry points, but as well the companies, the industries, has definitely emerged and changed over time.
Okay, so that's interesting. Those three vectors are definitely, I agree, kind of in the key ways that that criminals are able to get in. And it's interesting you bring up, and you've now mentioned it a couple times, particular types of companies or industries with maybe less advanced, maybe less advanced, less well resourced security teams or strategies. I mean, I know that obviously during the pandemic, we've seen a lot going on with hospitals. That's kind of been, I know one of the stats I've seen a bunch is, I think there was something like 600 ransomware attacks against various healthcare and healthcare providers and hospitals. But aside from that, and actually before we go into that, I think that the part with hospitals points to one of your points out, which is having that really wide kind of swath of even less traditional endpoints or entry points. You have all this. One thing I learned from a friend who's now CEO of a med tech security company is he said, all of this super expensive and complex hardware in a hospital is wildly outdated in terms of the software running on it, because it gets to a point where this company spent a couple $1 million on a I have no idea how much this stuff costs, but on an X-ray machine in 2004, and guess what? It can't run anything more than Windows 2007 on it to operate everything, and so any vulnerability that's on there is going to exist, is going to exist forever. I think as we kind of move more into that age of 5G and IoT, it's going to be that may be a little bit more of a risky vector.
Hank, I need to share with you this story. It's
okay,
actually really funny and scary at the same time. So a few years ago, I went to the dentist, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm, doing the stuff there, waiting, and then the doctor does his stuff and all good. And then with the discussion, it's like, what do you do? And I'm like, yeah, I'm in cybersecurity. It's like, oh, great, I need your help. look, this laptop has a small window and it says that my data and files are encrypted. I'm like, what?
Wait, seriously?
True. Yeah, seriously, a true story. And he's like, yeah, my IT told me just ignore it and continue working aside. I couldn't believe it. This is a real story. So what happened is basically that he had some kind of ransomware that was stopped and just, encrypted a few files. And the IT manager, like the advice of the IT manager was just leave it like that. You continue using your laptop and then, don't pay attention to that. So I think, coming back, as I said, it's funny but scary at the same
Yeah,
time. I
yeah.
think the healthcare industry in general, depending on where we are, is very, very different level of cyber maturity again. If we look at the Americas, we are talking about, HIPAA regulation. We're talking about very strict controls. When we go to Asia, where I am, currently, well, in some countries, there's absolutely no regulation around, data, personal health information, data protection, and security. So it is really important as well to take that in consideration. And this leads me to another point, which is actually the fourth entry point through third parties. Because even if you as a company has you have a very, very good security posture, or you think that your controls are pretty much okay. Of course, 100% security doesn't exist, but you can recover. What about that attack coming and starting from a third party that you're using? So I'm a little bit diverging, but I think a compromised update of the software is something that can happen. And how many of you today in the audience have a tool that will check the integrity of the files when you are updating operating systems or software or whatever you have within your ecosystem? I guess not many. And this is something that we don't look at so often. And it's actually, again, another level of sophistication of attack, because rather than attacking one company, we are attacking and leveraging of a service provider, for example, and targeting 20, 30. We have seen recently a lot of those supply chain attacks. And that is what we call scalability in business. So they have a channel where they are able to actually very quickly distribute the ransomware attack, and they will use it. Now, on the other side, of course, we're talking as well, this is one aspect of scalability, but we're talking as well about affiliates who are cyber criminals just using and buying ransomware as a service and distributing it as well. So the way of how cyber criminals are looking at it is, where will I get the best deal? And how can I scale my business? And that's how they do it. So it is fascinating. But again, coming back on the industry perspective, I definitely think that healthcare has been on the top of the list for, especially during COVID. Even recently, there's a very new cyber attack, not apparently ransomware, but disrupting the COVID-19 vaccine. Now we are talking as well about an increase of ransomware attack on manufacturing, where we have, again, non-traditional IT systems and, of course, large disruptions. We have seen many of those in different regions around the world, and it's only increasing.
Yeah, yeah, again, I mean, I can't believe that story about your dentist. That's unbelievable. I mean, really, it's just that's something else. So okay, and what you say about having a scalable option, I mean, it's just what we were talking about earlier, right? With running it just like a business. I mean, it really that's what you figure out as, in today, if you're, whether you're a tech company or whatever, you figure out the best model to be able to scale your technology, and here they are doing the exact same thing. So to go back to the attacks themselves a little bit, we discussed the initial entry, but I'm curious to know, what does it look like from there? And I'm also wondering if this is where what you mentioned about the loaders starts to come into the conversation, because it sounds like you're pretty passionate about that, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say in that regard. So hopefully that's happening now.
Yeah, Hank, absolutely. I think what we have as misconceptions is that if we have good security controls, we probably will be able to detect the latest ransomwares, or we will be able to stop them at some point. Well, there are various scenarios, including one that is detailed for Ryuk ransomware, that defines on how the cyber criminals have been persistent into trying to evade all security controls after learning about the company. So first, that stage about I need to learn about you. I need to understand how do you protect yourself so I know how to evade those controls and go towards my goal. And the goal in this particular scenario that I'm talking about was getting to the, of course, the main server that will handle all of the accounts of the company, and then only then activate the ransomware, spreading it across all systems. And when you look and you try to analyze from a technical perspective this particular attack with a Ryuk ransomware, you find out that again we are using simple PDF files that are sent, and then or other form of file, but the file doesn't contain directly the malicious software. It will actually contain this loader. Now, what is extremely interesting and really fascinating is that those loaders do not come preloaded in attachment. They are downloaded from a separate website that is accessible via a link, and they are fileless malware that do not leave trace for an antivirus to be detected. So, and on top of that, again, I have tried to look at the steps, and the initial detection for me was a very important aspect because I was trying to understand literally, how can I, stop that, detect it at least, or be aware of it. And basically, with the new loaders, I did not find any tool in the market that was able to stop that. So that means that when we're talking about traditional tools like, the behavioral based detection tools, etc., this didn't work here. And for the as well funny story, there are a few loaders that are on the dark web that are literally known or basically being famous for being 100% undetectable. So they basically, that's how they sell them. So again, if we think that this particular entry point of human weakness, or basically the humans, is not something that we need to worry about, I would definitely advise the audience to read about those loaders. Obviously on the next step, when we look at the attack, again, it's all about first, you need to get this initial footprint. Now, when you get this initial footprint, you will need to perform what we call in privilege escalation, and definitely the security professionals understand that. And when you perform that, first of all, you need to find a way to perform that. You need as well to evade the control that will eventually alert the security team that, oh, there's something that is going on. Why we have a privilege escalation here? Someone is having administrative rights while it shouldn't, or a workstation or something. And this is also something that it's quite fascinating. It's not like, cyber criminals will say, oh, you know what, let me just check here and try to brute force the admin password and keep on doing that. That's not how it's done. They will try to eventually run it in a, for example, legitimate process that looks like it is actually authorized to run as an admin, or basically as a root. So those kind of methods allow them to elevate privilege. If you elevate privilege, you are an admin on that particular machine. Now the question is, how do you manage to perform the lateral movement? And that means, how do you manage to spread across the network? There are several ways to do that depending on the company's security measures. But again, there are certain aspects that we don't realize from the security perspective, especially when we are a CISO or a security professional or even in IT. We very often look at controls from outside. We monitor what's happening and the attacks from outside, but we forget that attacks can happen from the inside. So whenever and when the attacker is already having those privileged access within the company, they are able to stay there stealthy for a while until they find a way to spread around. And spreading around again is to get to your DC. Basically, you need to get to your server, to your main server, and you still don't run or you don't try to encrypt the systems. You want to maximize your impact for you to maximize the ransom, right? So you try your best, and it can take even weeks until you're able to do that. And in this particular scenario that I'm talking about, what was also really interesting is that for a few times, the cyber criminals have been detected. There was an activity that was detected, was stopped by the security controls, but they kept persistency. And because of that, they managed at the end to circumvent those controls. Again, a lot of other techniques that we use, from finding the legitimate processes, running with them, to literally, as I mentioned, attacking the integrity of some software or updates, or if you are already impersonating an employee, you can very easily use that fact to spread around across other colleagues of that person. So there are various points, but I think what is very important here for our audience, especially, again, I have seen that we have a lot of IT and security professionals, is that it's not like cyber criminals don't know that you have spent $500,000 on security. They probably guess, and they investigate and try find information about your company. So they will try to circumvent those controls. Now, what you can do is the next question, which we probably will be discussing very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's one particular point in there that I'm curious about that you made, which is that it's kind of this idea of lateral movement, right? And I think it's a term that most everybody who's listening is familiar with, and one that people talk a lot about in discussing these attacks. But in that sense, I'm thinking about another thing a colleague once said to me, which was that ransomware is the only, and maybe not the only, but one of the only types of attacks where the criminal actually wants to be discovered and wants to reveal themselves. Now, I don't know if you agree with that anecdote or not, but how long will they persist in that infrastructure before? I mean, we've seen it like with with SolarWinds, we were told, oh, they've been in there, and I know that wasn't ransomware, but with that scale of attack, oh, they've been in there for, what they say, 6 to 12 months or something like that before actually taking advantage of these of this backdoor through the update and things like that. So I'm just curious, in your experience, how long have you seen it take for all of this to happen? What's kind of the timeline? Does the more advanced ransomware we have now and the larger ransoms that are being demanded kind of create a longer timeline, or are they just getting more efficient about it?
I think, Hank, it's a very interesting question. And if we look at the statistics, they always help us, right? But they are statistics, and I'm going to comment on that. But if we look at those numbers, the average breach or compromise detection around the world is, I think, approximately 200 days. And in Asia Pacific, it was, until last year, it was more than 400 days, over a year.
Wow.
So someone is in a company for over a year and the company doesn't know. Now, one thing that I really like, and is to say that I think it comes from Finland, if I'm not wrong. Statistics basically are lies, lies, and statistics. Why? They're based on numbers. So if you want a really good answer on that, you would need to analyze further industries, type of attack, cyber maturity, region. What are the threat actors? Who are there? Are they actually doing that because they are very sophisticated criminal groups, or are they just affiliates, young guys or girls who are trying to get some money? It all depends. And if we look at the profiles, they are different. So they will spend the amount that is proportionate to what they want to achieve. If cyber criminals know that they can get 40 millions out of a ransomware attack, well, you make your math. It does make sense, right? To spend even 1 year inside the company. Simple. It's about money. It's again about business. That's how the mentality is. But on the other side, what is really interesting when we talk about ransomware, and Hank, I'm sure you have heard about that, that when we're talking about a ransomware attack, very often we discuss about the ransom amount as such, as I mentioned. Keep saying 45, 50 million because it's really hilarious, and it's like the amounts seem not to stop or be or increase. So when we're talking about those amounts, we are talking about only the ransom value, that the business is disrupted. The business cannot operate, cannot sell, cannot provide services to customers eventually. Employees are not productive anymore. The reputation is impacted. So the losses are way beyond the amount that we eventually might even look at or think about. We have a business interruption due to a cyber attack like ransomware. The consequences and the financial losses include so many factors, from profit loss to, for example, legal, of course, costs, which I will come back, which is very important, to communication costs, because you need to communicate with the client somehow when you tell them that I cannot communicate with you. And then at the end, last, if you even are able to pay the ransom itself. Now, when you look at the financial losses from all those costs, you realize why companies in so many cases decide to pay the ransom. And now when they come to the payment of the ransom, the other aspect that is, in my view, fascinating is the negotiation. When you have, you need as a company to find a company or a service provider to negotiate for you the ransom with the cyber criminals. Fascinating. And at the same time, you might think, oh, this will be something that is really, terrific or scary, or sometimes it ends up being like, well, we're here for business. We want just this money. Can you pay? Can you give us a discount from the other side? Oh, yeah, we don't know. You have made, for example, last year 20 million, so I'm not sure we're going to give you a discount. Believe me, we are in a world where that is a way of doing business. And now on the other side, again, I'm like really fascinated about the stories, because obviously whenever there is something like that, there is on the other side people who will take advantage of that. So there are companies, and this story was hilarious. There was a company who was claiming that they were helping decrypt the data for victims. What they actually were doing, they were negotiating with the cyber criminals. So they got some really heavy discount. They got the keys from the cyber criminals and they decrypted the data. So the scenarios of this basically attacks and the ransomware in general have gone so wide, from different type of industries, different type of attacks, different type of, again, making money from all parties involved, because at the end that's what it is. That is, basically one word: fascinating. And the more we read about it, the more we learn, and the more we try, or at least I would advise our audience to try to think from a cyber criminal perspective rather than from a security perspective or from an IT perspective. They don't have the same approach, and their goals are very different from yours.
Right. Now, there's one thing you mentioned in there in particular, which is the negotiation tactics, which I think is that's fascinating. It'd be very interesting. I know. Have you ever actually negotiated yourself? Like,
I cannot disclose anything about that, unfortunately. But whatever I'm discussing is basically, there are things that I'm for sure I can actually share. So those are practical things that hopefully will raise awareness about. Now coming about payment of ransomware negotiation, I would like just to mention as well that this is a topic that is getting a lot of attention, not only from the perspective of negotiation with cyber criminals, but as well, is that legal in the country where the company operates. So certain countries do not allow any more for ransom to be paid. So companies who become victim of ransomware, they are sometimes in really, really big trouble. Because
Yeah.
obviously, again, we're talking about big operations stand up, everything is stopped, you cannot continue your activities, and
Right.
there's no way for you to recover all systems within 2 hours, for example. So we need to be pragmatic in general. It's not like people want to pay the ransom, is because in some cases they didn't have the choice. So again, I believe that's why we don't have a complete worldwide law that says no one is allowed to pay ransom.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a lot of companies would not be able to operate.
Right. Right. So okay. So let's pretend we're in a country where you are allowed to negotiate, or you are allowed to kind of decide if you're going to make that, pay that ransom or not. From your perspective as having been a CISO and just being in that mindset of, I mean, I'm sure you run through these scenarios all the time, right? And so I guess my question is, I think people outside of security sort of look at it and say, well, how do you, and even people inside, how do you decide whether you're going to pay it or not? Like, what are kind of the criteria that you run through? Because even, I mean, at least from what I know, and your knowledge is obviously way more in depth than mine, but even if you do pay, you're not necessarily, it's not a guarantee that you're going to get 100% of the data back. It's not a guarantee that there have been, maybe some copies of it made elsewhere. But if you don't pay, maybe you have to rely on disaster recovery. Maybe your DR strategy isn't super strong. I mean, what's kind of what's going through a CISO's head in these situations, and how would you kind of guide someone on, if you can, a little bit of input on whether or not, or what may point to a situation where it's okay to pay it off or it's not, or kind of what's the process there?
Well, I would say, Hank, the first thing is to very clearly understand that if you are a victim of such a sophisticated attack, might not be able to stop it completely. But what you need to aim towards is to reduce the impact of such an attack. And that means response and detection and response. Now, when we talk about detection and response, especially around ransomware, it is not just a traditional or your traditional cybersecurity incident response where you need to reformat the laptop or workstation of someone and all good and it's working. It's not the case. First of all, if you are facing that situation already, you cannot at that time start building the answers to all those questions. You need already to know how much are you able to pay or ready to pay. What's your business stakeholders' risk appetite? And did the board, if we're talking about a big company, does the board actually even accept to pay a ransom, or they don't want? Have you put in place a process that allows you to validate that with your legal department? Again, it's for you to see and manage any updates within your country, ensuring that you will not do something that is illegal and put you out of business. And the third point, which I as well like before ending on the last point that is extremely important, is do you have a cryptocurrency account? We don't think about it. How are you going to pay 50 million to cyber criminals?
Right.
You're
Right.
not going to write them a check, right, and send it over
I'm
post or
definitely
wire.
not.
Checks are still used in many countries, by the way. I'm just saying that, but in Asia we still use checks. So think about it. Do you have a cryptocurrency? If you don't, well, so how will you manage that if you need, or if you are in that position, unfortunately, that you don't have any other choice? And lastly, of course, that means that you need to prepare yourself to a response that is adapted to a ransomware. Again, coming back and closing the circle, we're not talking about a traditional cyber incident. We are talking about a complete shutdown, for example, of a very important part of your attack surface or your ecosystem that is losing money every hour, where shareholders are, getting really, really nervous. You need to do something about it. And doing something about it needs to be prepared before. You cannot get onto those kind of discussions when you are in the middle of the crisis. That will be too late.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. That's good to know. It's funny you bring up the crypto bit because it's like how else are you going to access that much money in such a short amount of time? Well, just go buy a few Bitcoin and you'll be good to go. Or if you really want to try and tempt them with about 6 billion Dogecoin, I guess you could as well. But either way, I guess they just care about getting their money. But um, so kind of getting we're getting close to time here, so I just have a couple last questions for you. The first of which is, maybe two or three uh, kind of key things people who are listening now can do to go out and make sure that they have the right stuff in place to mitigate this type of risk, and mitigate being one of these victims of ransomware and having to go through all these processes we've been discussing for the last hour.
Hank, я буду говорить по-русски.
Yes, that. No, she said it in French, I'll understand you, but you got me. All right, let's hear it.
I'm going to start with one control that, might be the most effective ever. This
Mhm.
this type of ransomware that will not be deployed on systems that have Russian as a language within their settings.
I've heard this. Yeah, yeah.
It's amazing, right? So change your language, add Russian, and you're fine. Obviously, disclaimer is a
Right,
joke. Don't
right.
take that as the magical control, but it does actually,
Mhm.
literally work for certain type of ransomwares. And this is, of course, again, if we're going back at the beginning, I mentioned that ransomware as a service is something that is getting as well more popularity, and therefore to protect certain type of countries, the cyber criminals who made the ransomware decided to find a way to avoid the companies in the country themselves being attacked or basically being encrypted. And this especially is as well from the perspective to protect as well them from being in trouble. So if you are in a country and then you attack companies in another country, your liability and the risk associated with being arrested are probably much lower, especially if we're talking about cyber laws that are not across the world defined and agreed on. So we definitely see that as a trend, and I love this example. Now, a little bit more realistically and practically for our audience, first of all, just to realize that if you have 95% of your vulnerabilities fixed across your environment, doesn't mean anything. I'm going to tap on the 5% if I'm a cyber criminal. So this kind of as well philosophy and approach that it's only about numbers and trying to show that we are doing our routine, I believe is not successful. And we have seen it with many, many cyber attacks that led to millions of losses. So I think the first point for me is ensure that you consider your attack surface and don't focus on KPIs that are irrelevant. So if your attack surface or environment, basically the assets that you need to protect as a company, include OT, which is operational technology, industrial control systems, include Internet of Things. Don't ignore them and say, oh, I'm going to take care of my IT, because you're not actually being efficient in protecting the company's asset and systems. This is the first extremely important, in my viewpoint. The second point, ensure that you have the response and detection working really well, because it's not anymore a question that I will implement the controls. That is really impossible to have 100% security and 100% assurance in nowadays complex environment. You need to be able to detect. And now, when we're talking about detection, again, for example, and I really like this example, is SIEM, right? A tool that will help you to triage the alerts and
Mhm.
send you the alerts, will only detect what you tell it to detect. It will not magically tell you what's happening in your environment unless you tell it what is your environment. So again, the second point here, which I really would like to focus on, is ensure that you have the proper response and recover in a way, detection and respond in a way that is smart and you understand your gaps very well. And the last point, I would say, pragmatism is key. So if you want to protect your company, try to ensure that you address the high risk. Don't say, oh no, that will not be the way of how cyber criminals will exploit my system. Try to have those quick wins and those non-negotiables for your company that you fight over. Because if not, you will be just an easy target. And you don't want that, because obviously the impact might be much, much bigger. So I think if I look at the 3 points, those are the 3 points. Don't forget to look at the whole company. It's not only the living room, it's the whole house. And then ensure that, if you have an alarm put in place, you don't have it only on the main door, but as well on the windows. So you're able to detect if you have gaps, find ways to address those gaps. And lastly, address the fundamentals. Don't be pragmatic. Make sure that you understand that you can be a victim as well. It's not impossible. Any company in any industry can be attacked by cyber criminals. It's a business. So they will scale, they will try to find new customers, and anyone can be part of that market share.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are fantastic. I hope that everyone on here can take each of those and kind of maybe go out and over the next couple of weeks, next few days, maybe just take a look at things and just shore up maybe a few things that, we're all busy, things slip through the cracks. So maybe there'll be something that you realize you need to shore up there. So Magda, before we move into questions, any last takeaways for the audience? Anything else any other knowledge you want to drop for them?
Yeah, Hank, absolutely. I can talk about this for hours, by the way.
I guess it's not a question of volume.
But I think lastly, what I would like to share with our audience is that one very interesting point or advice for people or individuals, professionals who need to continuously argument why they need investment in cybersecurity, why they need additional controls with, for example, the board, the business stakeholders. Look at cyber risk quantification. What does it mean? It means putting dollars towards your cyber risk. I gave you the example, business interruption due to a ransomware attack. The consequences, what are the impacts, can help you to have a much better discussion with the business than you going and telling, hey, we have a ransomware, we might be attacked, we need controls, I need 5 million budget. That will not work. But if you go to the business, you tell them the cyber risk associated with a business interruption following a ransomware attack might be 50, 70 million, they will listen. Change the way of how you address that. And again, at the end, it's all about money, it's all about business, it's all about ensuring that efficiency. And so you as a security or IT professional, you need to look at it from that perspective. And a business is there to generate revenue, not just to invest in cybersecurity. So that is where the bridging the gap between why we need to invest in cybersecurity is very important, comparing to why we are asking for additional budget as well.
Right, it's tying it to the business need. I mean, that's what drives everything. So cool. Well, this has been awesome, Magda. Thank you. And I want to move into, we've gotten a couple questions here. We only have a couple minutes left, so I won't get to all of them. But I do want to move into a few of those. So let's see. Okay, this one seems like you have a fan in the audience. Your experience includes working in the Cyber Crime Center at the US DoD. Were there any particular lessons learned from that role? That's an interesting one.
Well, Hank, that is not my previous experience. So perhaps someone read an article or something that where I was associated. I did not. So
Okay.
I have worked with private organization, collaborated with public organizations across Asia and Europe as well, and some other regions. But I did not work with that association. So
Okay.
when we talk about cybercrime in general, I would say my personal experience would be limited to the interactions that any cybersecurity professional would have from threat intelligence and reports generated from agencies like Europol, Interpol, etc.
Got it. Got it. All right. Well, we'll have that person. Maybe I'll see if I can get their name and go ask them where they got that information from. Anyways, but this is one that's a little more broad, and it has to do with zero trust, which is a topic that everybody's talking about these days. It's pretty broad. I mean, how do you see zero trust playing a part in overcoming some of these modern threats that we've discussed today?
Hank, I think it's a very good question, but if we look at a concept like zero trust, from the name, I think it brings a very good point. You cannot trust anything. Basically, by default, you don't trust anything. And if we look at the new modern threats, that's how it should be in order to continue, to face them. Now, the problem is when we talk about this kind of new concepts, is how you will be able to implement those concepts within your company. How will you ensure that you efficiently implement zero trust while sometimes even your patch management doesn't work? So again, it's all about ensuring fundamentals first, and then if you want to move into additional concept, have a strategy. Don't just try to address it all across. I have discussed about this topic previously, and I think it's fascinating, but we have the tendency, we want to do good, we want to bring the most innovative thing to our company, but we need to have a strategy. It's not that straightforward, and for that it will be a phased approach. Where can we do it? What are the areas that we really need to focus on, and how do we ensure that slowly we adopt it across? And lastly, of course, before doing that and going to this kind of things, check your fundamentals. If your quick wins and fundamentals are wrong, there's no point in going and adopting any innovative technologies.
Right. Okay, cool. That's very helpful. So the last one, we're going to sneak in one more since the first question was a pretty short answer there. So this one actually, this hits close to my heart and what we've traditionally done at Lookout. Obviously, we're moving, we're adding more to our portfolio, beyond just mobile. But this one actually is a question about mobile phishing, and how it's kind of a growing issue, especially across SMS and social media, and I'll add a couple more to what this person asked. You include even like dating apps and obviously third-party messaging apps like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, all these ways that people can get to you on mobile. Have you seen that as an issue in the past, and do you see it growing as an issue, and how do you see people kind of overcoming it as an issue for their organization?
Well, I think, Hank, definitely there's an increase in the way of how cybercriminals are using as well those instant messaging applications, social media, mobile, in order to get even the two-factor authentication. So it's just so easy to trick people with social engineering. Like, there were two scenarios that I'm going to mention. The first is like, oh, I just sent you a code by mistake. Can you send it back to me? Literally. And this works. So this is the first one. The second one is when a cyber criminal mirrors a website, obviously as a traditional phishing, but then they at the same time log into the official one, and then the person receives the OTP, enters the OTP to the fake website, and the cyber criminal does the same in real time. So those are just a few examples. So mobile, I would say threats in general are there, they're increasing. The additional problems to that is that people are sometimes unable to detect threats basically on mobile. They can't see, for example, exactly who's sending. Like, on the Outlook on your workstation, you can double click, you see the whole email, while on mobile, that is not something that everyone is able to do. So those small aspects definitely increase the risks. And if you are compromised within the company, again, that means that you are breached, you don't have control over that particular device or asset. So in general, companies address that with mobile device management and solutions that are similar. Now, I do think that it's all about having a balance between technology, process, and people. So keeping on ensuring or showing to people of how it happens will be only supporting the technology. And the technology enforces certain controls, but if you don't have the right awareness, the technology will fail you as well anyway. So a balance between both, and of course the process where you make it very clear to the colleagues of your company, the employees, that they need to inform